When we come to think about the views that the ancient astronomers had, and with naked eye, patient observations, what are all the kinds of celestial movements which they would have had been able to notice, would have been able to discern, would have been able to measure in some way with very simple instruments? We get a very good learning for basic beginning positional astronomy. So in that sense, going back into history is a very, very nice historical tool for us, educational tool for us to learn basic positional astronomy. In general, what would have been noticed? Inspiring stars, stars of varying brightness, and with some amount of time given to observing these, and some care, and also some kind of mathematical and instrumentation to discern what's happening in the sky, the daily movement of the stars, and what's happening over a given night and later times, and so on. This would certainly have been noticed. It's surprising that many ancient cultures do not really talk so much about varying brightness. They do. There are various mentions, but really not as many as one would expect. To some extent, of course, the constellations themselves, the way constellations evolved in different cultures, have all looked at this. They use the brightest stars to pin the constellation, and the other fainter stars around. So in that sense, there is definitely a discerning of the varying brightness of stars. So that's as far as the brightness was concerned. And then one moved on from there to looking at what's happening in terms of changes in positions of stars. Pinning constellations to the brightest of stars, and noting their positions in the sky, changing position in the sky, would have told us about what's happening, the diurnal movements, peculiarities of different geographical positions in these diurnal movements would also have been noticed by tribes moving from one location to another. If they differed considerably in their latitudes, would then have noticed the altitude changes in pole star. There are enough evidences in all mythological lore and so on about that. And yes, then the stars rising and setting, the fixed direction related to this, and the directions themselves were, in some sense, the measuring of those directions were the beginning of instrumental astronomy in almost all cultures. Noting down of the cardinal direction. How are the cardinal directions defined, and in a given location, how are they to be determined, cardinal directions? So there are amazing examples of how in Harappan cities, for instance, just about every structure seems to be having cardinal alignments, north, south, east, west kind of alignments, which could have been arrived at only after having good amount of positional astronomy observations in place already. Then the sun's movement and the way it differed, its movement in the sky, the way it differed from the movement of the stars. This would definitely have been noticed. And then the annual movement of the sun, what in the Indian culture has been referred to as Uttarayan and Dakshinayan. These would have been noticed. And in addition to that, with memory in cultures would have been noticed over a period of time, the differences that are coming in the sky due to precessional motion. There are definitely a lot of lore and mythology, as well as serious observing statements which talk about cultures having noticed the shift of the position of the sun with respect to the background stars at a given time of the season, how this changed. In the Vedas, for instance, there are references which talk of how sun in its annual movement goes maximum northwards and southwards, and the position where it turns back, how that position has changed from being near one star at one time, and then at a much later reference in Vedas which talks about its being elsewhere, and so on. And such studies progressed. And so in all of this, what was needed essentially was a pinpointing of objects in the sky, having a thorough friendship with these objects, looking at the sky and immediately noticing, okay, an object there, its movement over a period of time, from that a measurement of time, and then onwards to noticing different patterns like the diurnal movements, then patterns like the annual movements. In the diurnal movement, the location of pole star and its constancy and so on has been inspiring throughout the ages. So here we have a quote from Shakespeare, but Shakespeare came after many thousands of years of this having been noticed. But even now, today, a child, when it gets to know about the constancy of the pole star and given a small tool to measure that, finds it just as inspiring. And moving on from there, these gave kind of a background against which one could notice longer term changes. And also in these shapes, certain lore was imagined, which to sometimes there is similarity and sometimes there is dissimilarity between different cultures, which itself makes for a lot of interesting historical, geographical studies to do in this. And then moving on from there, we come to if we ask certain questions ourselves, we find that, like questions like the brightness of stars, which we were thinking of. Why did the ancients not emphasize this so much, varying brightness of the different visible stars? And another thought that occurs, could the relative motion of the pole star around the celestial pole at much earlier epochs in history have been in any way discernible to primitive tools? And if we look at the way the pole star myth has entered into different cultures, the lore and so on, perhaps that might give some clue in terms of whether at all any kind of measurements might have been able to discern this. Maybe nobody discerned it, but if we try and make estimates of what would have been the kind of movement pole star might have had in earlier epochs, and a knowledge of history and the instrumentation people had access to, this gives rise to so much of learning for us in terms of positional astronomy as well as history. And all these different variations that have been noticed, that we know of. Now, modern day positional astronomy has evolved so much, we know the whole rich variations in celestial observations that there's so much of richness in it. How much of it was noticed? Well, most certainly the diurnal movements, the annual movements, the precessional movements, we know they have been noticed. Even certain